All right, get ready because today we're going deep on vision.
Ooh, sounds interesting.
Yeah, you know how we go from light, those little particles, to actually seeing the world.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy when you think about it.
We're using chapter 5 from this sensory systems book we've got, and
Lots of good research in there.
yeah, tons. It's really eye-opening.
Nice.
Okay, I'll stop. But seriously though, have you ever really thought about what's actually happening when we see?
Most people probably haven't, no. I mean, it seems so simple.
Right. But it's so much more intricate than you might think.
Oh, absolutely. It's an incredibly precise process, the whole thing.
Well, let's start with the eye, right? I mean, we all know it's involved, but how does each part actually work together?
We'll take the lens, for example. It can change its shape. Did you know that?
Yeah, I think I remember learning about that.
It's called accommodation. And it means no matter what you're looking at, close up or far away, the image always ends up focused on the retina.
That's the back of the eye, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And isn't that what starts to go as we get older? Like, that's why we need reading glasses?
Exactly. The lens loses some flexibility over time.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's a natural part of aging, but knowing how it works, accommodation, I mean, it helps us understand all those vision changes, as we get older.
Okay, so we've got the lens focusing the light on the retina. But what actually turns that light into something our brain can understand?
Ah, that's where the magic happens, the photoreceptors. Rods and cones.
Okay, I vaguely remember those from high school biology, maybe?
Yeah, well, think of them like neurons. Specialized neurons that translate light into signals, electrical signals.
So those photons, the light particles, they actually change something inside these cells.
Yeah, pretty much. Each photoreceptor has a special molecule it's light sensitive, like rhodopsin in rods, for instance.
Okay.
When a photon hits that molecule, it sets off a whole chain reaction like a cascade, and that changes the cell's electrical charge.
Wow, it's more complicated than I thought. So it's not just light hitting the eye, it's this whole little molecular dance going on.
That's a good way to put it. And that change in the electrical charge, that's what gets sent to other cells in the retina and eventually all the way to the brain.
So wait, the eye itself is doing all this processing. The retina, I mean,
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's not just passively taking in light, it's a processing powerhouse.
wow. Okay, so then what? The signal is there, but how do we actually see an image?
Well, before the signal even gets to the brain, it's got to go through this whole network of cells in the retina. They process it even more.
Like refining it.
Exactly. Think of it like a relay race. Each cell passes the signal along and tweaks it as it goes.
Okay, I can picture that.
So you have things like horizontal cells, for example. They're super important for lateral inhibition.
Lateral inhibition, what's that?
It basically enhances edges and contrast.
Huh. So that's what makes things look sharp. It seems kind of counterintuitive that inhibiting something would actually make things clearer.
Yeah, I know, right? But basically, by dampening signals from nearby photoreceptors, it makes the strong ones stand out even more.
Oh, so it's all relative. Clever.
Totally. And then there are bipolar cells. They take input from multiple photoreceptors and refine the signal even further.
So I'm guessing there are different kinds of bipolar cells, just like there are rods and cones for different light conditions.
You got it. Some are for light areas, others for dark areas. This is all setting the stage for the brain to see patterns, shapes.
So the visual system is analyzing things right from the start, breaking down the scene into its parts.
Yeah, and this pre-processing in the retina, it's like a huge efficiency boost.
Like sending a summary to the brain instead of all the raw data.
That's a great way to think about it. And the cells in charge of sending that summary, ganglion cells.
Oh, right, ganglion cells. Those are the ones that form the optic nerve, right? Like the highway to the brain.
Exactly. But here's the cool part. There are different types of ganglion cells, each specialized for different kinds of visual information.
Oh, wow. So some for motion, some for details, maybe some for color.
Yep, a real division of labor. It's incredible how much information is flying down the optic nerve.
So where does all that information go?
First stop, the thalamus, the brain's relay station.
Right, the thalamus. It directs traffic like for all our senses.
Yep, exactly. But it doesn't end there. It's just a pit stop on the way to the visual cortex. That's where the real magic happens, the heavy lifting of processing.
Okay, so the thalamus is like a way station, and the visual cortex is the final destination. But wait, I remember something about a crossover point somewhere in there.
You're thinking of the optic chiasm. That's where the optic nerves from each eye, they partially cross over.
The optic chiasm. Why would they cross? Didn't that seem like it'd mess things up?
Maybe, but it's actually super important for us to see the world in 3D.
Really? Okay, I'm all ears.
All right, so think about it. Each eye sees the world a little differently, right?
Yeah, because they're in slightly different spots.
Exactly. So the nasal half of each retina, that's the part closer to your nose, it sees the outer part of your visual field.
Things off to the side.
Right. And the temporal half, that's by your temples, it sees the inner part of your visual field. Now, at the optic chiasm, the fibers from the nasal half, they cross over to the other side of the brain.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Information from the left side of what I'm seeing It ends up being processed on the right side of my brain.
Exactly. And vice versa, of course. So each half of your brain gets information from both eyes, but it's all about the opposite side of your visual field.
Wow, that's wild. But why go through all that trouble?
It's all about depth perception. By comparing those slightly different images from each eye, the brain can figure out how far away things are.
Oh, that makes sense. The bigger the difference, the closer the object.
Exactly. It's super clever.
It really is. This is blowing my mind. So much is going on behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface. We still need to talk about what happens in the visual cortex, where all that information really gets put together.
I can't wait to hear more about that. The eye is like its own little computer, and then the brain adds another layer of processing on top of that. It's incredible.
It really highlights the amazing power and complexity of the visual system.
It really does. And it makes you appreciate how much work goes into something we do without even thinking about it.
Absolutely. It's a true marvel of evolution. Yeah, for sure. And it's amazing, those images on our retinas are flat, but we see in 3D. How does that even happen?
That's a great point. So how does the brain, add that depth?
Well, it uses a bunch of cues. Some need both eyes, binocular cues, and some just need one monocular cues.
So the brain is combining all that info to create the 3D experience.
Exactly. So let's talk about binocular disparity first.
Okay.
Our eyes are a little bit apart, right? So they each get a slightly different view.
Right.
The brain compares those images and uses the difference, the disparity, to figure out depth.
So if something is closer, the difference between the two images is bigger.
Yep, exactly. Try it. Hold your finger up close to your face, close one eye then the other. See how it jumps?
Oh, yeah, it does. I never realized that was my brain doing depth calculations.
It's pretty cool. Now, what about those monocular cues?
Yeah, what are some examples of those?
Well, one we use all the time is relative size. We just know things look smaller when they're farther away.
Makes sense.
So if two things are the same size, but one looks smaller, we know it's farther away.
Like a car way down the road, it looks tiny.
Exactly. Another one is linear perspective. Think about railroad tracks.
They look like they come together in the distance.
Yeah, parallel lines seem to converge as they get farther away. That gives us a sense of depth, even in a flat picture.
That's how artists make paintings look realistic.
Right. And then there's interposition.
Interposition.
Yeah, if one thing is blocking another, we know the one behind is farther away.
Like if one building is partially hidden behind another.
Exactly. Our brains are like detectives, using all these clues to figure out the 3D world.
That's a great way to put it. So we've talked about how the info gets to the brain, how it figures out depth, but what happens in the visual cortex? You mentioned those processing streams.
Oh yeah, the dorsal and ventral streams, they're like specialized pathways, each handling different parts of the visual info.
Okay, so break it down for me. What's the dorsal stream all about?
It's the where pathway. It's all about spatial information, like navigating, moving around, understanding where things are.
So if I'm reaching for my coffee cup, the dorsal stream is helping me find it and grab it without knocking anything over.
Exactly. It's always figuring out locations, movements, all that spatial stuff.
Wow. What about the ventral stream then?
That's the what pathway. It's all about recognizing objects. What are we seeing? What category does it belong to?
So that helps me tell a coffee cup from a teacup, for instance.
Yeah, and it's not just simple objects. It helps with faces, expressions, symbols, all sorts of things.
It's like the brain's interpreter, making sense of all those signals.
Exactly. And even though they have different jobs, these two streams work together really closely. They're always talking to each other.
So it's not just about where things are or what they are, but how it all fits together.
Right. Our brains combine all that info plus our own experiences to create this whole picture of the world.
And sometimes that can lead to those visuals illusions, right?
Exactly. Illusions are super interesting. They show us how the brain takes shortcuts to make sense of things. And sometimes those shortcuts, well, they lead us astray.
Like we see patterns that aren't really there.
Yeah. Remember that Kanisa triangle?
The one with the phantom triangle?
Right. There are no lines actually making a triangle, but our brains fill in the gaps.
It's like it's trying to complete the picture.
That's it. And there are tons of other illusions that mess with our perception of motion, color, size, even depth. They all prove that we don't see reality perfectly.
More like an interpretation, right?
Yeah, a best guess based on what we know and what our brain expects to see.
So it's almost like we each have our own version of reality.
That's a deep thought. It shows that even vision, which seems so simple, is actually super complex and subjective.
It really makes you think, what does it actually mean to see something?
That's a question philosophers have been wrestling with forever. But I think we can say that vision is an active process. It's not just about the signals, it's about how our brain interprets them.
Like our brains are constantly building and rebuilding our visual world.
Exactly, using everything from the signals coming in, to our past experiences, to our expectations.
It's an incredible system. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize just how amazing perception is.
It really is. It's one of the most amazing things our brains do.
Yeah, it really makes you think, how much of what we see is really just our brain filling in the blanks?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of research now showing that our expectations, our past experiences, they can really change how we see things.
So two people could look at the same thing and actually see it differently.
Exactly. Our brains are always trying to make sense of the world, and they often use shortcuts to do it.
Heuristics?
Heuristics, yeah. And those shortcuts, they're usually really efficient, but they can also lead to, well, biases and misinterpretations.
It's like our brains are trying to fit new info into what they already know, even if they have to, like, twist it a little.
That's a great way to put it. It shows that perception isn't passive, it's an active construction. We're combining the sensory info with our own beliefs and knowledge.
So we're all creating our own little realities.
Kinda, yeah. But our perceptions might be subjective, but they're still based on the real world. Our brains are always getting feedback from our senses.
So it's like a back and forth between our internal model of the world and what's actually out there.
Exactly. And that back and forth, that's what lets us navigate the world, understand our experiences, basically survive.
This has been so eye-opening. Vision is something we just take for granted, but it's so much more than meets the eye. Huh.
It really is a marvel of biology and evolution. The more we learn about it, the more we realize just how incredible the human brain is.
Yeah, our listeners are probably going to need a minute to digest all this. We've covered a lot, from the anatomy of the eye to, like, the philosophy of perception.
It's been quite a journey. Hopefully, it's made everyone a little more curious about how vision works.
I hope so. There's still so much more to learn about the brain and all the amazing things it can do.
Absolutely. Neuroscience is constantly evolving. There are new discoveries all the time.
So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those minds open. The more we learn about our brains, the more we understand ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah, and maybe next time you look at something, you'll pause for a second and think about all the amazing things that had to happen for you to see it.
On that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into vision. Thanks for listening, everyone, and until next time, keep those minds curious and those eyes wide open.